我们继续跟戴雅门教授来做访谈。Professor Diamond, you just mentioned that one of the example of the global democratic recession is the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And not only the election of Donald Trump, but also I think nowadays Trumpism had really captured the Republican Party. Over like 70%, even 80% of Republican voters, they are approving what the President Trump had done. How can you explain that phenomenon even after 2 years of this Trump getting elected, and still it had captured the Republican Party, and now we are seeing, is there a genuine change of a political politics in the United States nowadays?
I think that there are at least two major explanations for what's happened with the Republican Party. One is that the composition of the Republican Party has changed somewhat. The more moderate, suburban, reflective, economically conservative, but maybe socially tolerant voters, many of them have left the party. So one reason why he's got 90% support in some polls, but 80% at least in most polls, some more support among Republicans, is that the Republican Party has shrunk to a much narrower base. It used to be 30 to 35% of the American electorate, and at one point even slightly more identified as Republicans. Now it's about 25%. It's easier to get 90% of 25% than 90% of 35%. The second factor is that those who remain as loyal Republicans, and frankly the same is true of Democrats, have come to have a very tribal identification with their party. And I think there are a lot of similarities here in Taiwan. Political party then becomes not just a political affiliation, but a social identity, almost an ethnic identity. And so you follow your team, your political ethnicity, your tribe first, and then you kind of decide what you favor and what you believe based on where the party stands, because the party must be right, because it's your identity, it's your party. And so I think this helps to explain why Trump has been able to remake the Republican Party and so rapidly redefine its attitudes toward international trade, toward immigration, toward minorities, and so on. Now, a lot of these policy positions have been gathering in the Republican Party for some time, with the rise of the Tea Party and of backlash against globalization, liberal elites, and so on and so forth. But Trump has really accelerated it, and I think he is playing upon the tribal nature of partisan affiliation in the United States.
Just this Thursday, there's over 350 newspapers published editorial against Trump's blaming the news for what's happening. And do you think that, how do you explain that in terms of American democracy, like you see it?
Well, we have a president of the United States who has abused and pilloried the independent media with an intensity, a regularity, a venom and a cynicism that is unlike anything we've seen from any president in the modern era. And that includes Richard Nixon, who had a pretty dim view of the press. So the press are independent, and they are fighting back, not just for themselves, but for liberal democratic principles. And I think they are conveying to their readers and to the politicians in the United States that they are not going to be intimidated. I think that's exactly the right attitude for the press, to stand up for press freedom and for press independence, and to refuse to yield to intimidation. There's a more subtle challenge that the press faces in the United States now, and I'm not sure it's meeting it quite as well. And that is to avoid falling into the trap of becoming a partisan counterweight to Trump. Now, of course, Trump characterizes any media that criticizes him as partisan, irresponsible, fake news, and so on. It's a little more subtle, but I do notice, I watch cable television a lot, and of course MSNBC, that's just, you know, it is kind of pretty much openly a kind of liberal democratic medium, the same way Fox News is Republican and conservative. But, you know, even the networks, the CNN and so on, they do tend to have a lot of commentary. And even in the newspapers, you'll see now more editorializing outside the editorial page than you would have a generation ago. And I know journalists are really struggling to defend and maintain their professionalism. It's hard to do with a president who lies boldly and pervasively all the time, every day, multiple times a day. So if you correct it, you look like you're being partisan. But it is a continuing challenge of the media to uphold that sense of professionalism, coolness, independence, and so on, neutrality as much as possible.
Being a journalist myself, of course, I'm very sympathetic to what they've done. But the thing is, just like the New York Times had said it after the election, said it, we got it wrong. Meaning that no one expected Trump was getting elected. Just like, had they got it wrong this time, misunderstanding what the general public opinion is, what's your gut feeling about this? Put it in the midterm election. Do you think that the Republican will lose the House, or still that the Trumpism will win over?
Well, no one, well, I shouldn't say no one, but many fewer political analysts, media analysts, political scientists are dismissing Trump's political prospects now, either in the midterms or in 2020, the way they did in 2016. We've all been burned and chastened as a result of that experience. That being said, all of this is probabilistic. How can we know? You know, we're not the Wizard of Oz pushing a button to determine the future, and even if we did, in the case of the Wizard of Oz, it was all a fiction. So all we can speak is about probabilities. And I would say, kind of reading the political analysis, that the Democrats probably have about a 70% chance of gaining control of the House of Representatives. The problem is they had a 70% chance of winning the presidency too in 2016, and they didn't do it. So other things can happen. Look, you know, Xi Jinping may capitulate before, in this trade war before November, and if Donald Trump gets a big victory in the trade war, I think that would help Republicans a lot in November. Maybe there'll be an international crisis before November in which Trump looks like a strong leader. Maybe there'll be one more round of tremendously good economic news that will lead voters to say, well, you know, let's give the Republicans another chance. Nevertheless, if you look at the data, you look at the discontent, you look at the swing voters in swing districts, you look at what's been happening in the by-elections, where the Democrats have been running very strong in Republican districts, I think the odds are strong, not certain, but strong, that the Democrats will win control of the House of Representatives. It's very unlikely that they'll win control of the Senate because the numbers are just formidably difficult. Only a third of the Senate is up for re-election, and most of those seats are Democratic seats.
The by-election you're referring to is Ohio election.
Well, and before that, the by-election in Pennsylvania, where the Democrats actually won a deeply Republican House seat.
One of the things you mentioned that I like to bring back is foreign policy and democracy. You mentioned that there is a tradition of promotion of democracy in the previous president. How do you see the current president, Trump foreign policy? Did they have a democracy goal in their hand, or they just totally given up on this?
You know, they've not given up on it. Advancing and defending democracy remains under President Trump an important stated goal, and I think one of a number of foreign policy objectives of the United States of America. Now that said, it's a very strange thing. Let me note the duality and paradox. I think personally, Donald Trump cares little about democracy in the United States or the world. It's not something he's ever spoken about. A little bit, you know, when someone inserts some language in his speech, he'll say something formulaic, but he's never spontaneously expressed a word of caring or concern about the state of democracy and human rights in the world. And if you look at the people he loves to interact with, like Vladimir Putin, for a time Xi Jinping, until they fell into a trade war, Kim Jong-un, who he has praised as a strong and even, quote, funny, end quote, guy, so the great, you know, comedian Kim Jong-un, and you know, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. He gets along with these people a lot better than he gets along with the democratically elected Prime Minister of Canada, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Australia, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, arguably our three closest allies, right? I mean, it's just bizarre. At the same time, if you look at his administration, both the previous National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, the current one, others in the National Security Council, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of Defense, even James Mattis, a wonderful man who was my colleague at the Hoover Institution. These people understand and are continually reaffirming the importance of democracy, universal values, our democratic alliances, to our own national interests around the world. So this persists in American foreign policy. It's just kind of, we're in a very anomalous period where the presidential administration is supporting this, but there doesn't seem to me much personal investment in it on the part of the president himself.